windows, the tower wasn't there. Totally different facade than this house. So each window has a little sheet in it that tells you about the person whose name is the window. And some of the elements in the window. You can go on and see. I will tell you that
It's live. Let people know where we're going.
Come on upstairs. We're going to go look at the Foxhole Window. And of course, it's not just a Foxhole Window. And I'm going to take my mask off because it keeps slipping and tickling my nose. So welcome upstairs from the balcony. You of course get to see parts of the windows you never see before. But I want to start with the face of Dumbarton. Now the story goes, of course, 1849, We leave the Montgomery Street Church. We move into this facility. We have an architect design it who's a member at Foundry. But we keep that church, sell that church, and then we move into here because we're not poor anymore. We are middle class. Dumbarton has become respectable again. So, the church functions pretty much as you see it until 1898. And in 1898, the church then has moved from middle class to upper middle class. And they start saying we need to get a new facelift. So instead of having what was called the Methodist Gothic front with just the brick facade, they go into this Romanesque architecture. And if you recall the front with the yellow brick, they then start with the art glass, similar to what you see on the sides. And then they start selling the memorial windows. And the memorial windows, we think, cost $1,200. They took 2 bids. They ended up with a bid from Gibson Art in New York. And there's a whole history about how he went out of business, but his sons resurrected the company. So it's Gibson that had booklets of patterns. And so the trustees at that time got together, they went through different patterns, and the only numbers that we have right now are $1,200 for not only these windows, but what was the paper mache, decoupage, extra stuff, which is all gone now, and we just have smooth walls. So this window here in the center was dedicated to Henry Foxhole, who is the big name in Methodism in D.C. He was an armaments dealer. He built Foundry. He built this church. And he and his daughter and his son-in-law, McKenna, are all memorialized in the big fan window here. Numerology seems to be very important to the stained glass artists. Of course, we know numerology was important in medieval times when glass windows moved from Islamic Spain and Europe into Christian Europe. So we see also 8 circles around the main circle, or 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 supposedly stands for 7 days that God took to create the world, and then add on the day that Jesus rose from the dead and you get 8. Doesn't work for me, but that's what 8 supposedly stands for. And then of course the big symbols such as the cross with the light rays coming out of it, and the crown meaning Jesus sovereign on earth. All of the symbols in the center part of each window come from pretty standard Christian iconography, which we share, of course, with Catholics, with Lutherans, with Episcopalians. So it's not that these are Catholic windows, these are just symbols that were universal and the glass makers could make them. So the way that we researched the book, Jane Donovan is our goddess. She has gone back, interviewed people, done the research on the finances of the windows, and she's written a book for us that we're printing up now. She explains the symbols in the top part of the window, the center part of the window, and then she gives the history of the people memorialized in each of the windows. So as we stand here, you can see that there are 4 big windows on either side of the sanctuary. There's 2 up on the altar area by the organ. Then we have the harp below us, and then the stairwell windows, and that gets us to a total of 16 windows. We still have space for new windows. So if you look at the art glass windows that we still have here, just think about this. You too could be memorialized at Dumbarton United Methodist Church. Just send us a check and you can get a window. Although the check's got to be pretty large these days, not $1,200 like it was in 1898. So we can go downstairs and I'll tell you a couple stories about some of the incredible people in the windows.
All right.
I feel like I'm still in the classroom. Are there any questions? All right, what did we just cover?
I don't think there's. Well, you're welcome to chat anything for our live folks. If you have any questions or comments, we'll see them here. But I'll follow you, Ellen.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thanks, G-Hank.
And also, in some of these windows, there was a church on the foot side.
This space is still available. Your name here. And if you don't like that one, there's this space available here. And more embarrassingly, the space below us is the women's bathroom. And that's available as well if you want a small memorial to yourself. So what we've done in the past, and we're going to do this again, is we've got a set of note cards that we had printed up years ago for each window. We're going to make these available at Christmas time. And then from the book that we're having printed up, we've taken the writing of Jane Donovan and the photographs of Alan Mayer. And then these are going to be QR coded right in here, so you can walk up with your phone and pop in to see the videos that we're going to be making about each window. So let me tell you one of my favorite stories. So come on over to this window. So this window is dedicated to William Craig, his wife Amanda Craig, and Amanda's husband, Henry Logan. No, William's daughter, Amanda. Too many wives, too many daughters. So at the very top, we have the all-seeing eye of God, which, again, we don't talk much about that in Methodism, but totally cool. Could have talked about that when we talked about money today. Then in the center, of course, just like we have in the Foxhole symbol, we have the cross with the symbol of sovereignty. Now, William Craig was a godly man. He was Sunday school leader, and that's a big deal in Methodism. He was a teacher, and then he was a principal at the old school we had on Montgomery Street. And then he got one of those appointments you hear about from President Grant after the Civil War. He was the sanitary inspector for the city of D.C. One Sunday morning, and I have to think that the windows would have been open, the drunken sailors out on the canal and the canal workers were making so much noise at the bar down in Wisconsin and Dumbarton Street that William Craig, grabbed a bunch of the Dumbarton men, went over to the bar, roughed up those sailors and canal workers, and dragged them back, sat them down on the pews, and made them listen to the sermon. So I've thought about putting that in 2021 terms. What if we went over to the coffee shop, unplugged the Wi-Fi, grabbed all of those people on their computers, and told them there was free Wi-Fi over at Dumbarton, and have them listen to the sermon? Or maybe we just take over their Wi-Fi and pipe the sermon to them. Anyway, I don't think it would happen these days. I don't think we could lay on hands and get people into the sanctuary. But I love the story. So let's go over and talk about the Civil War. So in this window at the very top, we have an anchor. Then we have the Baptismal Font, which looks exactly like the Baptismal Font we have in the church. And it's dedicated to the father, William H. Eads, and his son, William R. Reeds, and daughter David Eads, and William's wife, Martha. So Martha was William R. and David's mother. So one of the things that we turned up is we started looking at who owned slaves in Dumbarton. And we found the manumission paper from when William H. went into the court in D.C. and filed the papers to release, I don't know if that's a proper term, but I kind of like that idea of giving someone their freedom. Charlotte Gustus. So she was 24 when William H. paid $625 to Mr. Belton, Maryland, and then she became the Eads cook. Martha had died early on, and there were 5 kids, so Charlotte was cooking not only for William Eads, but for all the 5 kids. And Eads followed the law. April 16th, 1862, Abraham Lincoln makes emancipation in D.C. a legality, and you can get money for releasing your slaves. So you took the paperwork to the court to prove that not only were you loyal to the Union, but you also could prove that you purchased that person. You could get up to $300, and then the person who had been enslaved would be able to walk out with their freedom papers. So we have that record from the .gov, from the archives. So Eads, we know, was a staunch loyalist. He wrote lots of letters about what was going on in Washington, D.C. at the time period. He worked for the Union side. We can't figure out if his children fought in the Civil War. At the very beginning in 1861, he said he was going to keep his boys close to home. He dies right after the Civil War, 3 months after, and then here comes the part that I love the most. Out of all of his family, the woman who survives is his daughter, Margaret. Margaret takes all of her inheritance, invests it wisely, and at her death in 1905, she has $100,000 to give as a bequest for the Home for Indigent Widows in D.C. And so if you walked out down Dumbarton and turned right down to Ann Street at 29th and Ann, there's this gorgeous mansion. That was the Eads Home for Indigent Widows. It survived 1905 until 1989, and then there was some skullduggery where they were letting the old ladies die out. They closed it, they sold it. I think they sold it for $3 million in 1989. Today it's worth $13 million, and the president of the Smithsonian lives there, and his wife, who's the president of the board of the Phillips Gallery, live there. And I'm sure that all those ghosts of the indigent widows are sitting around the indoor swimming pool, keeping their toes warm in the winter. So I think I could go on like this for a lot longer, but let's just look around at some of the other windows. But lots of stories as well. So in this window, we have John Dixon, his first wife, Ann Dixon, and Catherine Dixon, their daughter. Now, John Dixon has married Ann, she dies, and not too long after that, he marries a second time, Anna. So Catherine is the daughter from the first marriage, and this is something that I think a lot of people are finding these days. What happens to the first wife, the second wife, the third husband? So the first wife is memorialized here with her first husband, with her only husband, while in the same time, poor Anna Dixon, wife number 2, is left out in the cold. But Anna Dixon, wife number 2, eventually gets her own window in the stairwell in 1901. So in the meantime, we've got John and Ann here forever together, and the chalice and the holy grapes. And of course, all of these Christian iconographies are typical of not just Methodism, but of course all of the denominations. So let's go up on the stage, the Holy of Holies, and look at the English family. So one of the sweet things, it's interesting, in 1898, a lot of these windows were given by daughters. And it's amazing that these daughters, of course, had the financial wherewithal to make these donations. So this is David English and Alcinda English, and their daughter, Virginia Fowler. So their daughter gave it. This is unusual that it says who gave it. Most of the bequests are just in the records. So one of the sweet things about this is an alcove that most people don't see up by the organ. But over here is the story I told today in church. So this is little Clarence Fowler's window. So a lot of these windows are husbands and wives and daughters-in-law, but this little window is just for one little boy, 8 years old. He died in New Jersey, I believe. He's buried up in New Jersey. I assume he must have come to church to visit his grandparents. But now that this building has been redone, this is actually backing onto a closet, and a special light had to be installed. But most of the time, little Clarence just lives in the dark. So the good news is that his grandparents, David and Alcinda, are here with him. So little Clarence, 8 years old, is not completely alone in the sanctuary. So luckily Grandma and Grandpa are here. And as a grandparent of a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, I just keep thinking about how sad that would be, not only just to lose your grandson, but also to just think about his continual presence all along. So the coolest story that I keep pitching are these opposing windows. So the window with the baptismal font is the Eads, and we know that he was a staunch Union supporter. Right on the complete opposite, we have the Wheatley window with the Bible and the bleeding heart, the corazon. So Wheatley, Francis Wheatley, was a staunch Confederate supporter. Now the Wheatleys and the Eads stayed in Dumbarton together their entire lives. Eads' sons were not sure if they fought on the Union side, but we know that Eads was giving money, supporting the soldiers, and one of the things that Eads writes, that this was a Union hospital, and the women would come in with their last pennies to see their husbands who were dying in these beds here in the sanctuary, because this was a hospital for 2 years. So as Eads writes, these women spend their last pennies to come say goodbye to their husbands. And all of you who've seen Little Women can think about that. And he at least is trying to give money to the widows so they could go home. And as I said earlier, they walk in the door wives, and they walk out the door widows, because their husbands were on their last days, and that's usually when you would send for the wife to say goodbye. So here we have on the complete opposite side a Confederate family. Now we know that Francis Wheatley was a godly man. His sons fought for the Confederacy. In fact, one of his sons was even a Mosby Rangers. And if you know the Mosby Rangers down in Virginia, they were the elite of the elites. They were the cool kids in the war, and they were terrorists in this region. So Mosby's lead ranger was Clarence Wheatley, who died in a skirmish in about 1862. So he died early on. So I think that's one of the fascinating stories that Jane Donovan keeps talking about, is that here we have something that divided our nation in such incredible bloodshed, and yet it's right here in our church, Union, Confederate. Now you would think that they would be at odds with each other. But Francis Wheatley was even one of the executors for Eads. He was even one of his pallbearers. So the Wheatleys never gave up their membership in Dumbarton, even though this was definitely a Union side. Abraham Lincoln came here when Bishop Simpson preached to rededicate this after the hospital was closed. We have a few other Confederate supporters. We have lots of slaveholders. I'm pretty sure the Dawes had owned slaves. We know that the Eads had slaves, even though they were for the Union. And so a lot of the people here were going through the DC Emancipation Program. In fact, the Sims' son was the judge who ran the court for the emancipation process. So for that manumission, you had to go into that courtroom, and it was a Dumbarton congregational member who ran that court. So, again, I feel like I'm going on and on and on. If you go downstairs, we've got the extra windows in the stairs that are dedicated. One of my favorite stories, of course, about how Anne Dixon gets listed here with her husband. His second wife, Anna, is by herself in the stairway, so at least Anna gets, some credit. There's another woman we know nothing about, Maddie Brown. She died when she was 21. All we know is she had I can't think of another word for a kick butt party when she was 16. So her sweet 16 party was at their estate. That's it. That's all we know about Maddie Brown. Died when she was 21. We have the Harp Window downstairs. It's the only window dedicated to someone who was not dead when the window was dedicated. Everybody else was dead, and they got a window named after them. J. Henry Wilson was the choir master for 40 years here, stood up here, led the choir. And when he was alive, he got a window, which is kind of the best way to go, right? You want your memorial when you're alive, not when you're dead. So I think at that point, if you have any questions, you can send them in, or I could go grab my phone and you could text me, 301-529-0819. Thanks, G.A.
Sure, great, thank you. Bye, everybody.